All right, let's talk about the Cold War. You guys are probably somewhat familiar with the Cold War. This was the U.S. Soviet war that was kind of an unspoken war. I shouldn't say an unspoken war, a non action war, meaning there wasn't a lot of like troop movements of killing and massive battles. But what this dealt with was U.S. Soviet relations in the Cold War dominated foreign relations from 1945 to 1991. And what this did is this pinned communist Russia and democratic U.S. Against the democratic U.S. And usually superpowers would solve things through diplomacy, but in this case, these countries were dangerously close to nuclear war. And I know I said there wasn't a lot of battles, but the battle was a mental battle. The battle was a battle of let's scare the other individual and let's create missiles and let's create bombs and create trials for these individuals. Now, many disagree with how the Cold War began. A lot of people actually blamed Truman for being too soft on communism. And to be honest with you, Truman really couldn't please anyone. The bottom line is Truman was actually a pretty good president. But the fact is, Congress hated him. The American people didn't really like him. But he just couldn't really please anybody. Was he too soft on communism? Well, he didn't really want to get involved in a World War III shortly after World War II had ended, so it's kind of hard to blame the guy. But the USSR, or that's what we'll kind of refer to the Russians as. Sometimes they're listed as the CCCP, and then you'll just hear me call them Russia. So lots of names that we'll be using here. But anyway, the USSR and the USA wartime alliance was actually a temporary halt in their generally poor relationships of the past. If you remember, from the time that the Bolsheviks or the communists took over Russia at the end of World War I, America had viewed them as a threat. However, FDR's advisors warned him that Stalin and Russia could not be trusted. FDR wanted to take the chance anyway. This was reaffirmed in their mind when they signed that non-aggression pact with Germany, if you guys remember that. However, Germany broke that pact, and Russia became naturally became a U.S. ally. The problem is we still didn't have a lot of trust for them. We just didn't have a great relationship. And it wasn't that Stalin was a good dude. I know a lot of times we refer to them as the good guys of World War II. He wasn't a good dude at all. Killed millions of his own people, and we just didn't really trust him. Now, once World War II was underway, the Russians took the brunt of the abuse from the Nazi Party. Half of all deaths in World War II were Russian. That's a crazy stat. Half of all deaths in World War II were Russian. At Yalta and Potsdam, the tension was already starting to grow between U.S. and Russia. The death of FDR would make this tension rise, as Truman was very suspicious of the Russians and didn't have a past relationship with Stalin like FDR did. And so that was kind of one of the big problems. As I said before in a previous lecture, the conference at Yalta, a lot of people basically said that FDR gave Russia or gave Eastern Europe over to the Russians. And looking back, that probably is correct. The problem with that is he didn't really feel like he had much of a choice because he might need their help with fighting the Japanese. So let's get to post-war cooperation. The founding of the United Nations in the fall of 1945 provided a hopeful future for the world. There was 5 major allies of wartime that were given permanent seats with veto power over certain things. That would be the United States, the British, the French, the Chinese, and even, yes, the Russians. These were 5 permanent seats that these groups were given to hopefully make sure that world peace continued. The Russians did reject a plan for regulating nuclear energy and eliminating atomic weapons. So that's kind of good on their part. The Russians also declined to be involved in the World Bank that was created at the Bretton Woods Conference. Now, the purpose of the bank was to help war-torn countries rebuild. However, the Russians felt like the bank was too close to capitalism and didn't want to get involved. The Russians did join the Nuremberg trials, in which Nazi officials were tried for war crimes. So that showed that they liked to participate kind of at their own leisure and kind of deciding on what works best for them. Satellite states. Soviet forces remained in occupation of many Eastern European countries after World War II. This would have been like Poland, this would have been like Yugoslavia, this would have been like Uzbekistan, all of those places. At Yalta, Stalin agreed to allow elections in these states or slash countries. However, these elections were manipulated and pro-communist leaders were elected. One by one, many communist dictators took over many Eastern European countries: Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, just to name a few. And you could go back to the old Eastern Bloc. That's what they called this. Oops, that didn't work. Let me scroll back down. Sorry about that, guys. Let me see here. And Czechoslovakia, as that, those were just a few of those countries, just naming that Eastern Bloc. Now, many apologists for Russia had agreed that Russia needed these satellite states to stay afloat and to create buffer states between them and other countries. Now, apologists just basically means they defend them. So many apologists for Russia had agreed that Russians needed these satellite states, meaning they didn't want to be close to Germany. They didn't want to be close to France because that was too close to capitalism. And so these buffer states allowed, if we were going to invade them, all of these smaller Eastern European countries to go down well before we got to the Russians. The bottom line is it was kind of an irrational fear because we weren't going to invade Russia, and if we did, it certainly wouldn't be going through those smaller countries first. The U.S. and British leaders were alarmed at the Russian occupation and involvement in these elections, especially in Poland, as this was flagrant violation of the agreements at the post-war conferences. And this is why people blame FDR for giving Eastern Europe over to the Russians, because this was all settled at Yalta. FDR probably didn't know this was going to take place this way, and he probably wouldn't have approved of it, and neither does Truman. But nonetheless, it did happen. And that leads us to occupation zones in Germany. Post-World War II, Germany was divided into 4 military zones to be controlled by the United States, the British, the French, and the Russians. The Eastern Zone was under the Russian control and eventually evolved into a communist state. The Russians liked a weak, divided Germany. Kind of almost felt like that was punishment for them, but also gave them kind of another buffer state. And they required reparation payments from the Germans. The British and the U.S. forces did not require reparations from their side. They felt that the stability of Germany was key to Europe thriving. They knew after World War I that we just completely destroyed them and demolished their economy. They felt like we wouldn't need to go down that road again. Since Berlin lay within the Russian side, they attempted to force the Americans, British, and French to abandon their assigned sectors of the city. Eventually, the Berlin Wall is created in the 1960s. That's a while. It takes place after a while. It actually takes place post the U-2 spy plane incident in 1960. But one of the things I put here in parentheses is the Berlin Wall was the symbol of the Cold War. I would definitely know that. That's a big deal. The ultimate symbol of the Cold War was the Berlin Wall because it just literally was a wall that they created, and that's something that is going to refer to in just a second with the Iron Curtain. Now, let's go back just a little bit. When you see that I said that it was eventually going to be divided into 4 military zones, understand this. This eventually is created West Germany, that is free, and Eastern Germany, which is communistic. The Eastern Germany side was run by the Russians, and the Western Germany side was eventually run by the British, the United States, the French, but eventually they just ran themselves, and they were more capitalistic in their mindset. And so this is where you have East and West Germany basically starting in the late 40s and going all the way to the 1990s, 1991, when the Berlin Wall falls. The Iron Curtain. In Missouri at a big conference at a college, I believe in Independence, Missouri, if I remember correctly, Winston Churchill declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across the continent of Europe and Asia. This metaphor is frequently used to describe the post-World War II Europe, and basically, through this, Churchill kind of complimented the Russians, but also at the same time said we need to be cautious about what's going on behind this curtain. Now, he never mentioned we should invade them. He never mentioned that we should destroy them. But what he did say is, behind this Iron Curtain, we don't know what's going on. But if behind this Iron Curtain, if we have more countries that fall to communists, then that's going to be a problem, and perhaps we should look into stopping the spread of communism, because if communism cannot spread, then communism will die out, was his viewpoint. And so that kind of why we would say the Iron Curtain was the symbol, the Iron Curtain had led to what they talked about with the Berlin Wall, because that ultimately showed that behind this wall, nothing good is happening as far as the capitalists are concerned. The communists, they seem to think it was okay. we're going to stop here because containment is kind of a big deal going through this. So I'm going to stop here, kind of a shorter lecture today. Again, as always, if you guys have any questions, please contact me.